Horror, a topic that everyone and their mother seems to have a take on, with various opinions from wrong.
Fourth game in particular is one of the best horror games of the past decade.
To right.
It's interesting the way that the FNAF community has pretty much unanimously agreed that FNAF 2 is the best game.
But I'm here to say that any opinion you've heard before this one is officially invalid. I know that there are people out there who've dedicated their lives to the craft of scaring people, but I've made one horror YouTube video now that took me a whole month to make. So I think I have full authority over the matter. I've reached what one can only call Horrorvana. And now that I've established my superiority, we can begin. Horror is a very tricky thing to nail, because to each individual, it's a very subjective thing. For example, some people might be afraid of heights, others spiders, and some of us women. I mean snakes. Yeah, snakes. Fuck. But since people have so many different fears, getting a majority of them to be afraid of the same thing is a very hard feat to accomplish. However, every fear stems from a primal instinct that we as humans developed for our survival, fear of the unknown. As monkey-brained humans thousands of years ago, being afraid of what we didn't know was how we were able to prosper as a species. There might be a tiger in the woods, so you have to make sure to stay in the cave to live another day. Or there's another human that looks slightly different than you and you have no idea what they're all about, so then boom! Racist! Anyways. That instinct, while still being used for important things nowadays to a lesser extent, is the base of every fear, because not knowing could get you killed. But unknown fears is too broad of a statement. Most games and movies choose to narrow it down a bit, because while a guy in a hockey mask or a cursed doll might scare some people, in my personal opinion, I can say it doesn't get me as much. And I'm what you would call a big baby bitch. I'm in a house right now.
No.
This house is pretty sick. Oh my god! Oh!
Hit? What happened?
That was so embarrassing. And it's that narrow-minded making a product that can only scare one type of person that I think causes a lot of the complaints fans have with horror. So let's discuss something that I feel like a lot of people miss when talking about this subject. The fundamental way in which you can approach horror. So I just used some vague words there, and lost some of you, because you're dummies, and definitely not because I word things very poorly. So let me elaborate. While we can all bitch about how jump scares aren't scary, or horror movies are poorly written, I think that most of the faults in horror lay in the roots of how the scary thing is presented. I think that horror in its most basic form can be split into two categories that I will call known and unknown threat concepts, trademarked by me. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when the main threat is known, this doesn't necessarily mean that the characters in the product are aware of it, but that the viewer themselves knows what's going on. So, for example, in movies like Scream, where the main characters aren't really aware of Ghostface's intention to kill them, but we as the viewer know that their death is possibly coming soon. So in this category, we can put things like killers, monsters, animals, predators, or even ghosts. Now this is a more popular type of horror, because of how easy it is to create an entity to quote-unquote scare the viewer, with the idea that we could easily be in the shoes of the characters who are experiencing this world. But when your camp counselor can come up with a story with as much depth as some of these multi-million-dollar productions, then we might need to change up the way we approach horror. Does that mean that this type of movie can't be scary? Absolutely not. Many of the greatest horror movies are based on the known threat concept, where there will be a killer or ghost, but the story and premise is so well written and interesting that it makes up for all the shortcomings that comes from being labeled as such. So I want to use an example of a movie that came out last year to show how a known threat concept can be done correctly. The Invisible Man. For a movie that all in all is not the most terrifying product out there, it plays to its strengths amazingly well. Because on the surface, it's just a movie about some regular fucker you can't see harassing a woman. Like he's not a killer, monster, or anything like that. Okay, actually before I go on, if you haven't seen the movie, there will be minor spoilers, but nothing too revealing about the movie that you can't really gather in the first 20 minutes of watching, so be warned. What I like about this movie is it doesn't really try to hide the meaning behind it. It's pretty obviously a look into problems and feelings of victims that suffer from abusive relationships and gaslighting. Our main character Cecilia loses the trust of everyone around her because of her ex-boyfriend turned invisible stalker, Adrian. isolating her from friends and family in a very similar but different way that a regular abuser would. She's stuck in a perpetual cycle of isolation and self-doubt that's only fueled by the fact that Adrian always seems to be right over her shoulder. Throughout the entire movie, the goal of the villain is never to kill our protagonist like many other movies, but to trap them. Trap them in a relationship that they want nothing to do with, playing into an idea of a fate worse than death. This movie offers perspective. Perspective on a feeling of not being able to escape that many people unfortunately have to go through. And that is the horror of The Invisible Man. Not ooh, floaty gun or oh my god, paint jump scare, but the implications it has on real world problems. Now, I don't want to harp on this movie for too long, because honestly, what I talked about was just a very small slice of what made this movie actually horrifying. But that's the difference between a known concept like The Invisible Man and something like your typical slasher or ghost film. The villain in the movie has his own goals, his own motivations behind his actions that make him more sinister than, a killer that is slowly taking down people one by one. Making your villain just as fleshed out as your main character is key to making the known threat concept work correctly. Now, unknown threats are a different beast altogether. The threat in the story isn't known by both the viewer and the characters, and typically they won't rely on using an entity to channel what's scary about the product, but instead use confusion and mystery to emphasize the horror aspects of it. The story writing will usually move at a far slower pace for you to become invested in the characters and learn sufficiently about the world, before pulling the rug from under you and scaring you in a way that leaves you emotionally impacted. So let's visualize it. If the known threat concept is usually more of a roller coaster with every dip being a jump scare, then unknown concepts are more like the drop towers, characterized by a slow build-up and a huge rush towards the end. The only problem is that while known threats can be bad, scary movies but still maintain a level of being fun, unknown threats are usually more of a slow-paced story-building approach. And if you mess that up, usually more than likely it can be a very painful and boring watch. And that's probably why there's little attempts at this type of horror, because it's not as much of a guarantee as a thriller horror movie. However, when done correctly, the payoff can be one of the most enjoyable watches possible. So, instead of using a movie like I did for the last example, I want to use one of the most viral games of 2017, Doki Doki Literature Club. Now, don't be fooled, because anyone who is mildly aware of the indie game space or horror YouTube knows that this is not your typical dating sim. If you're still lost because you're not a slave to the YouTube gaming pipeline, then let me give you a little rundown about what this game is all about. Doki Doki Literature Club is a typical visual novel game where you sit through a shit ton of dialogue, and occasionally make choices that will eventually lead to an ending where you'll be with one of the girls of your choosing. Sayori, Yuri, Natsuki, or Monika. Or at least, that's what it wants you to think. And if you ignore some of the warnings, thinking that it's some kind of joke, then that's probably what you'll think for a good 3 hours. Until... I think you get the point. This is a psychological fever dream cosplaying as cute uwu girls. It takes its time getting you to deeply care about the characters and their struggles, giving you tiny bits of foreshadowing and clues as to its real intentions. So let's talk about everyone's favorite quirked up girl next door, Sayori. Through the first half of the game, she's portrayed as your peppy next door neighbor who's been your best friend for years. She's always there brightening up the story and solving problems between characters. But, as the story progresses, she starts to slowly back away, keeping the player at arm's length until you confront her, and she's forced to confess that all of this is because she's majorly depressed. It throws the player for a loop, but gives them hope, because since it's a problem in a game, that means that there is a solution, a happy ending, in which you cure Sayori's depression and run off into the sunset with your anime waifus. And that expectation makes what happens next all the more terrifying. So mind you, this was a completely normal game until this moment. This is why I feel that this game very well represents what an unknown threat concept is. It keeps you on edge through the entire second act all the way to the end, never letting the player feel like they really know what's going on, coming back to what embodies unknown threats. Mystery and confusion. So now that I've established what known and unknown threat concepts are, I want to get to the penultimate point of this video. Horror doesn't just boil down to having the scariest images possible or the most terrifying jump scares. You have to know what you're working with. Want to make a game or movie with a ghost? Then make sure that it's more original than the hundreds of other products you're competing with. And don't forget that your ghost is a character too, that can only benefit from being more well written and fleshed out. Don't just have their motivations be, oh, you're in the house that I used to live in and I don't want you here, so I'm gonna kill you. Or you want to have a slow burning mystery with a lot of psychological horror? Then make sure you don't bore the fuck out of your viewer before they can get to the cool shit, or make it so convoluted that it doesn't make any sense by the end of it. Now, I boiled most horror in games and movies down to two main concepts, but never said that either is a bad way to do horror, because I don't believe that there are bad approaches, just bad end products. Hey, you, shit ass. Thank you for watching. This actually took me quite a long time to make, just because I had to like redo the video 3 times or so. I wasn't happy with the other versions of it, but I'm happy with how this one turned out. So, yeah, just hit the subscribe button and all that wacky stuff. Yeah.